They called 911 to stop my lake project, but one title search erased their access forever. I had finally purchased the property near Old Mill Lake, a secluded, serene piece of land that I had dreamt about for years, a place untouched by time where the water mirrored the sky, the trees whispered with every breeze, and the world beyond felt impossibly far away. From the moment I saw it, I envisioned a sanctuary, a private retreat where my family and I could escape the relentless pace of modern life. I imagined a small dock stretching into the clear, still waters, the sunlight glinting off gentle ripples, mornings filled with birdsong, evenings with the soft lapping of water against the shore. Every detail had been planned meticulously in my mind: the restoration of the lake, the landscaping around the shore, the subtle, natural enhancements that would return it to the beauty it once had before years of neglect. I had saved and waited, endured financial sacrifices, and navigated endless paperwork, and now it was mine. The excitement was electric, a pulse that made each day brighter. But that dream, so carefully nurtured, collided almost immediately with reality in the form of the Homeowners Association. The HOA, a faceless bureaucratic entity, claimed that the lake was not mine alone, that it somehow belonged to the community collectively, and they began sending letters, each more aggressive than the last, demanding that I halt construction immediately. At first, I thought these letters were a misunderstanding, something that could be settled with calm conversation, polite emails, and the occasional phone call. I tried reasoning with them, explaining that the property was legally mine, that I had purchased it through proper channels, and that no one else had legal access to it. I even provided copies of my deed, survey maps, and all the paperwork proving ownership. But the letters kept coming, now filled with legal jargon, warnings, and threats of fines. I responded each time, carefully documenting every interaction, believing that reason would eventually prevail, that logic and law would be enough to silence this growing hostility. I began spending more time at the property, walking the perimeter, noting where I would place the dock, measuring the trees to see which could stay, and which could be trimmed to restore the natural flow of the shoreline, imagining evenings when my children would skip stones across the water while I sipped coffee on the deck. But the peace I had imagined was elusive. Then came the phone call, quiet and hurried, from a neighbor who had always seemed friendly but now spoke with a tension that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "They're calling 911 to stop your work," he whispered, almost afraid I would hear someone else on the line. My heart raced. I had known that the HOA was aggressive, but this felt like a new level entirely. My sanctuary was no longer just a personal dream. It had become a potential battleground, a clash between private rights and collective claims, a place where every action would be scrutinized, challenged, and potentially blocked. I could feel a storm brewing before it even arrived, the tension thick in the air like the humid heat before a summer thunderstorm. I tried to remain calm, reassuring myself that I had followed every legal step, that property law was on my side, and that a simple call to the authorities would clarify the situation if anyone actually questioned my right to proceed. Yet, as I hung up the phone, an icy knot of anxiety settled in my stomach. What was meant to be a journey of restoration, creativity, and family joy was suddenly shadowed by confrontation. The once inviting land seemed to watch me, the rippling water reflecting my own worry back at me. Each visit, I noticed the subtle signs of intrusion, the tracks around the edge of my property that hinted someone had been there, the faint sound of vehicles stopping where they shouldn't, the occasional rustle of movement among the trees when I was alone. It was unnerving, the feeling that my personal dream had become a contested territory, a small island under siege by invisible forces. I tried to focus on the work itself, on the physical act of bringing the lake back to life, clearing debris, planting native species, repairing the dock posts I had salvaged from an old structure. Yet, every hammer strike and every plan set in motion was accompanied by the gnawing thought of the letters piling up on my desk, the warnings that seemed to escalate by the day. And then, As the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the water, I realized that this was no longer about the property, no longer about the lake. It was about asserting my right to dream, to create, to protect something I had fought so long to acquire. The tranquility I had imagined seemed both tantalizingly close and impossibly distant, the water shimmering with promise while the looming conflict threatened to muddy its clarity. I made a decision then, standing barefoot on the soft, cool earth at the edge of my property, watching the reflection of the evening sky on the lake's surface. I would not be intimidated. I would not let threats or letters or whispered warnings turn my sanctuary into a battlefield of fear. I would proceed with care, with respect for the law and for those around me, but with unwavering determination. This was my land, my dream, and the restoration of the lake would be my testament, a silent declaration that peace, beauty, and rightful ownership could not be undone by bureaucracy or intimidation. I began planning the next steps, mentally mapping how I would navigate the conflict with the HOA, how I would document everything meticulously, how I would protect my property without escalating tension unnecessarily. The dock would be built, the lake would be restored, and the sanctuary I had dreamed of would exist, no matter the challenges. That night, as I returned home, the sky turning deep indigo and the first stars beginning to twinkle above, I felt a mixture of apprehension and exhilaration. The journey ahead was uncertain, the road filled with potential obstacles and confrontations, but I also knew that the reward, the lake, the land, the fulfillment of a long-held dream, was worth every battle, every tense phone call, and every letter demanding compliance. I slept that night with visions of the lake dancing behind my eyelids, of the sunlight glinting on the water, of the quiet mornings and peaceful evenings that awaited. The dream had begun, and no amount of outside interference could stop it from unfolding. The only question was how far the other side was willing to go, and how far I was willing to stand my ground. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth as I drove toward Old Mill Lake, anticipation and anxiety warring within me. The sunrise painted streaks of orange and pink across the horizon, reflecting off the surface of the lake, which glimmered like liquid glass. I had planned this day meticulously, coordinating with my crew to begin laying the foundation for the dock, setting up equipment, and restoring the shoreline. But as I neared the entrance, a sight that immediately froze my blood in my veins came into view. A police car parked conspicuously at the edge of the property, lights off but clearly positioned to be noticed. Beside it stood a HOA representative, a middle-aged man with an air of self-importance, waving his arms in what I could only interpret as a "stop right here" gesture. My heart skipped, and a mixture of irritation and concern coursed through me. I slowed my truck to a cautious stop, rolling down the window as he called out, insisting that I halt all work immediately. I felt the familiar surge of frustration I had endured over the last few weeks, letters piling up, warnings escalating, claims of community rights that had no legal basis. But this was different. This was a direct attempt to intimidate me, using law enforcement as a shield for their claims. I stepped out, hands raised slightly to show I meant no confrontation, and approached the officer, my crew gathering behind me, tense and wary. The officer, a tall man with a kind but serious expression, asked questions in a calm, professional tone. "Who owns this property?" he asked, and I responded clearly, stating my name, the deed information, and explaining the project. The HOA representative interjected, his voice tinged with urgency and a hint of disdain, attempting to frame my project as a violation of community rules. I remained calm, allowing the officer to lead the conversation. He requested permits, documentation, anything to verify my claims. I handed over a thick folder containing the deed, the survey map, permits from the local authorities, and proof of ownership, all organized meticulously. As the officer flipped through the pages, I watched the HOA representative's confident expression falter slightly, replaced by irritation and disbelief. Time seemed to stretch as they reviewed each document, cross-referencing details, confirming boundaries, and checking zoning codes. I could feel the tension in the air, thick enough to touch, every moment amplified by the silent standoff. Finally, the officer looked up, nodding slowly, and said, "You're within your rights to proceed. This property is legally yours, and your project is permitted. Just ensure that all safety and environmental guidelines are followed, and there should be no further issues." Relief washed over me, a wave so strong it was almost dizzying. The HOA representative sputtered, trying to protest further, but the officer's presence had shifted the balance. The aura of authority that the HOA had tried to wield evaporated in the light of clear legal documentation and rational review. I thanked the officer sincerely, feeling both gratitude and vindication, and began planning the next steps in my mind even as the HOA representative stormed off, muttering under his breath, clearly frustrated by the turn of events. The police car lingered for a few more minutes, officers observing discreetly to ensure no violations occurred before leaving me in peace. My crew and I immediately got to work, the sound of hammers, drills, and conversation filling the once silent morning. Each task completed was a small victory, a reminder that preparation, patience, and adherence to the law had allowed me to reclaim control over my property. I walked along the edge of the lake, watching the gentle ripples reflect the morning light, feeling a profound sense of accomplishment. The conflict with the HOA had been a trial by fire, but it had also reinforced my resolve. This lake, this land was mine, not through intimidation or fear, but through careful planning, legal diligence, and unwavering patience. Yet, despite the victory, a subtle tension remained. I knew that the HOA would not give up so easily. They had tried the threat of authority, calling 911 to intimidate me, and while it had failed today, it was likely only the beginning of a drawn-out campaign. I considered the next steps carefully, thinking about how to secure the property further, how to communicate with neighbors, and how to document every interaction meticulously. Every action I took was strategic, calculated to prevent escalation while asserting my rights firmly. That afternoon, as we resumed work, I walked along the shoreline, taking note of every inch of property, the placement of each dock post, and the layout of the future landscaping. I could feel the promise of the project slowly coming to life, the lake responding to the careful touch of restoration, and my dream inching closer to reality. Yet, I remained vigilant. The HOA's overreach had been exposed, but it had also revealed the lengths they were willing to go. I could not afford complacency. Every email, every letter, every visit would need careful consideration and documentation. I reflected on the irony. An organization meant to manage community standards had attempted to disrupt a lawful, peaceful project, relying on intimidation rather than reason, and yet in the end, law and preparation had prevailed. By evening, the sun hung low over the horizon, the sky painted in shades of gold and crimson. My crew packed up, tired but satisfied, and I stood alone by the lake, taking in the calm, reflective water that mirrored my resolve. The encounter with 911, the scrutiny of law enforcement, and the HOA's misguided interference had become part of the story now, a challenge met and overcome. I felt a deep, personal triumph, a knowledge that no amount of bureaucratic threats could unseat rightful ownership when backed by preparation, documentation, and calm determination. That night as I left the property, the lake shimmered under the setting sun, serene and unbroken, a promise of the days to come, and a reminder that challenges, no matter how daunting, could be faced and conquered with clarity, patience, and courage. The days that followed the confrontation with the HOA were filled with a singular focus: knowledge. I realized that the best defense against their intimidation was not anger, not confrontation, but understanding every detail of the law, every record, every historical note about the property I had fought so hard to acquire. I spent hours at the county office, the building smelling faintly of old paper and polished wood, the quiet hum of fluorescent lights mixing with the soft shuffle of clerks moving through stacks of documents. I started with the property deeds, tracing ownership back decades, examining every transfer, every note, every easement that might affect my rights. Each page I turned was a piece of a puzzle, revealing a story of ownership, legal transfers, and the changing landscape of rights and obligations over time. As I dug deeper, I found references to the lake, to the shoreline, to access points, and to neighboring properties. There were notes about easements granted long ago, most of which were vague, some never recorded officially, and several that had clearly expired. The more I read, the more the picture clarified. The HOA's claims were built on assumptions, not facts. They had relied on outdated rules, verbal agreements that had never been codified, and interpretations of community access that had no legal standing against a properly executed property deed. The realization was electrifying. I felt a surge of clarity and, yes, power. Here I was, armed with irrefutable evidence, able to counter every claim, anticipate every argument, and protect my property without raising my voice or escalating tensions unnecessarily. I examined every covenant, every restriction, every note in the official records, highlighting dates, signatures, and any mention of community access rights. Many were ambiguous, written in language that sounded important but under scrutiny proved unenforceable. I cross-referenced these findings with county codes and regulations, nodding where the HOA's assertions contradicted the law. I began compiling a dossier, a meticulous record of every document, every observation, every historical reference that supported my case. It became a ritual, morning trips to the archives, afternoons organizing findings, evenings reviewing and annotating pages, connecting dots that others had overlooked. In the process, I learned not only about my property but also about the nature of bureaucracy and how assumptions can be weaponized when knowledge is lacking. I realized that power was not about threats or shouting. It was about having the truth firmly in your hand. Each document I copied, each note I made, reinforced that truth. The more I delved into the history of the lake, the shoreline, and my property, the more confident I became. I discovered maps from decades ago, showing the exact boundaries, noting which areas were private and which were communal, with official signatures and seals that left no room for dispute. These maps contradicted the HOA's claims completely, proving that their so-called community access rights had never been legally granted over my newly acquired property. There were moments of exhilaration, small victories that came with each confirmed fact, each piece of evidence that chipped away at the HOA's facade of authority. I could almost feel the scales of control tipping, the balance shifting in favor of truth and legality. But I also understood the importance of caution. Knowledge alone was power, but how I wielded it would determine the outcome. I meticulously documented everything, prepared for any challenge, aware that the HOA might attempt new tactics to intimidate me, knowing that the foundation of my argument had to be beyond reproach. The county office became a second home, the archivist familiar with my visits, offering guidance and pointing me toward obscure documents that were invaluable to my research. Every record told a story, a legal precedent, a historical note, a clue about how property rights had been enforced in the past. I learned to read the fine print, to spot loopholes and outdated clauses, and to understand which documents carried weight in a legal setting. Each discovery added layers to my understanding and reinforced my confidence. By the end of the week, I had a complete dossier, a powerful compilation that could withstand scrutiny and counter any claim the HOA might attempt. I felt the shift in my mindset as well. The fear that had lingered after their 911 call evaporated, replaced by a calm, resolute determination. I realized that true security came not from confrontation but from preparation, from knowledge that was both deep and precise. Walking back to my truck after one long day in the archives, carrying a thick folder of meticulously organized documents, I felt a sense of triumph unlike anything I had experienced before. The sunlight reflected off the windows of the county office, illuminating the path ahead, and I could almost see the battles to come, each one ready to be met with calm confidence rather than anxiety. The lake awaited, my sanctuary still intact, my dreams still alive, now reinforced by an invisible shield of knowledge. And as I drove home, I reflected on a simple truth. Knowledge wasn't just power. It was my shield against harassment, my sword against false claims, and the key to ensuring that the vision I had fought so long to achieve would not be stolen by assumptions, intimidation, or outdated authority. That night at home, I organized every page, every note, and every map into a single, cohesive presentation. I annotated, highlighted, and cross-referenced, preparing for any possible confrontation, ready to defend my property not with anger but with undeniable facts. Sleep came late, but it was deep and satisfying, punctuated by dreams of the lake fully restored, the dock in place, and the tranquility of ownership unchallenged. The HOA could threaten, they could intimidate, they could claim community rights, but I now had the ultimate weapon, irrefutable knowledge. And with that weapon, I was unstoppable. After days of meticulous research, digging through stacks of deeds, easements, covenants, and county records, the moment of truth finally arrived. I had obtained the full title history of my property, tracing ownership back for decades, cross-referencing every claim, every note, and every recorded document. The process had been exhaustive, requiring early mornings at the county office and late nights at my desk, fueled by coffee and a relentless determination to uncover the facts. Each document I examined built a clearer picture of the property, its boundaries, and the rights associated with it. The more I analyzed, the more certain I became that the HOA's claims were based entirely on assumptions, hearsay, and outdated records that had never been legally recorded. I pored over the title history line by line, scanning the legal language with a magnifying glass of attention that bordered on obsession. There it was, a single line of legal verbiage, understated yet absolute in its authority, buried deep within a deed executed decades ago, a line that changed everything. It stated clearly, unambiguously, that no recorded easement existed in favor of the HOA for my property. No claim to the shoreline, no access to the lake, no authority to regulate or interfere with my use of the land. Every letter they had sent, every warning, every threat of fines or action was legally baseless. I felt a surge of triumph as I read and reread it, each repetition reinforcing the undeniable truth. The HOA had no standing. I leaned back in my chair, letting the realization wash over me, the weight of months of anxiety and intimidation lifting from my shoulders. The power of knowledge was now absolute, but with knowledge came responsibility. I knew that the next steps had to be precise, deliberate, and legally impeccable. There would be no room for ambiguity, no half measures or emotional reactions. I drafted a formal notice, crafting each sentence with care, referencing the title search in precise legal terms, citing relevant state laws, and including exact references to the HOA covenants. I highlighted the absence of any recorded easement, the lack of legal authority over the shoreline, and the impossibility of enforcing any claim of community access against my property. I anticipated their arguments, preemptively addressing potential objections with citations from statutes, past rulings, and historical precedents. The tone was professional, calm, and absolutely factual, unyielding in truth but free of unnecessary confrontation or hostility. Every paragraph, every sentence, every word was designed to make the facts undeniable. I sent the notice to the HOA board, and their attorney, ensuring delivery was documented, time-stamped, and verifiable. It was a statement of fact, a shield of law, and a strategic maneuver rolled into one. I imagined the reactions as it arrived, the confusion, the frustration, and the eventual realization that their claims were nothing more than fiction, unsupported by the law, unsupported by documentation, unsupported by reality itself. I felt a sense of satisfaction, a quiet vindication, knowing that I had transformed months of harassment into a moment of clarity and authority. The notice would speak louder than any confrontation, louder than any shouting or threats ever could. In the following days, I monitored the situation carefully. Phone calls to the HOA board went unanswered, emails bounced back, and their lawyer's response was cautious, measured, and noticeably restrained. They had received the evidence, the formal notice, and they knew that any attempt to proceed without acknowledging the facts would put them in legal jeopardy. I felt a subtle thrill in understanding the power of a single document, a single line of law that could turn the tide completely. The lake, my project, my dream, was now fully protected, backed not by intimidation or fear but by absolute, undeniable truth. The shoreline was mine, the access was mine, and the authority to develop and restore my property lay firmly in my hands. I spent time walking the land, surveying the lake, and planning the next stages of the project with renewed energy and confidence. Every stake driven into the soil, every plan for the dock and the restoration work, carried with it the assurance that no external force could legally interfere. And yet, I remained vigilant. I knew that bureaucracy and personal ambition could lead some to test boundaries, even when the law was on my side, and I documented every step of progress meticulously, photographing the site, noting dates, and keeping copies of all correspondence. This chapter of the journey was about more than legal victory. It was about empowerment, about understanding that preparation, diligence, and clarity could overcome months of uncertainty and intimidation. The HOA, once a looming threat, had been neutralized not by confrontation, but by the quiet power of documented truth. The knowledge I had gained, the title search that revealed the absolute legal reality, became my armor and my weapon. I could feel the tension in the neighborhood shift subtly, the invisible weight of authority tipping in my favor, the realization spreading that the rules were no longer open to misinterpretation or manipulation. That night I stood at the water's edge, the lake calm under the setting sun, reflecting shades of amber, rose, and gold. The tranquility of the scene mirrored my own state of mind, peaceful, assured, and resolute. I had won a crucial battle without a single fight, relying on patience, research, and unwavering commitment to truth. The dock could now be built, the lake restored, and the sanctuary I had envisioned could finally take shape. And as I looked out over the water, I realized that this victory was more than legal. It was personal. It was a testament to perseverance, careful planning, and the extraordinary power of understanding and wielding knowledge wisely. The HOA's attempts to intimidate me had failed spectacularly, and the line of law revealed in that title search had rendered their authority meaningless. I had turned months of harassment into a moment of empowerment, a reminder that truth, properly understood and applied, could conquer fear, threats, and false claims. The journey ahead was still filled with work and challenges, but the foundation was secure, unassailable, and mine. Every sunrise over Old Mill Lake now carried the promise of progress, the assurance of rightful ownership, and the thrill of a dream finally, unshakably, within my grasp. 2 days after sending the formal notice to the HOA and their attorney, I returned to Old Mill Lake with a sense of cautious optimism and a renewed determination. The morning was crisp, the air carrying the earthy scent of damp soil and pine, and the sunlight danced on the surface of the lake, casting reflections that seemed almost celebratory, as if nature itself was acknowledging the shift in momentum. The neighborhood was quiet, the usual murmurs of activity subdued, almost as if the world had paused, giving space for change to take root. As I drove down the winding path leading to the lake, my eyes scanned the perimeter with vigilance, noting the subtle signs of movement, the occasional footprints in the soft mud, and the distant hum of cars along the main road. I anticipated resistance, expecting perhaps another call from the HOA, another letter, or even an attempt to physically obstruct my work. Instead, I was met with a quiet, almost uneasy calm. I stepped out of my truck, the morning sun warming my back, and noticed a neighbor standing at the edge of their property, watching cautiously. He murmured under his breath as I passed by, something about losing access, and how the HOA was really in trouble now. There was a hint of awe in his voice, a recognition that the rules of control had shifted, and that the so-called authority the HOA had wielded was nothing more than a fragile illusion. I felt a thrill of vindication, tempered by the need to remain methodical and deliberate. The legal notice had not just clarified my rights, it had fundamentally altered the dynamics of the entire neighborhood. The HOA's perceived power, built on intimidation, letters, and vague claims, had vanished with a single, undeniable truth. They had no legal authority over my property or the lake. Their community access rights were null, their threats baseless, and their influence evaporated. Standing at the water's edge, I could almost feel the invisible grip they had tried to exert dissolve into the air, leaving space for restoration, growth, and renewal. I set to work with my crew, beginning the long-anticipated task of building the dock. Each post was measured with precision, each plank aligned carefully, and as the structure slowly took shape, I felt a sense of ownership solidifying, not just of the land, but of the process, the labor, and the vision itself. The sound of hammers striking nails, drills whirring, and boards fitting together created a rhythm that was both productive and therapeutic. I moved along the shoreline, clearing debris, trimming overgrown vegetation, and restoring the natural contours that had been lost over the years. Every sweep of the rake, every placement of stones and logs, felt like reclaiming a piece of the dream that had been threatened but never broken. As the hours passed, subtle signs of life returned. Birds that had long avoided the disturbed area began to flit from tree to tree, their songs piercing the morning air with a melody of hope. Frogs croaked near the water's edge, their calls a testament to the revival of a delicate ecosystem. Dragonflies darted over the surface, shimmering in the sunlight like tiny jewels, and the gentle ripples of the lake reflected the first real peace the project had known since I acquired the property. I paused often, taking in the scene, letting the quiet triumph of progress fill me. The water sparkled, clearer than I had remembered, reflecting both the sky above and the sense of accomplishment that surged within me. Each small victory, the installation of a dock post, the removal of a stubborn log, the clearing of an overgrown patch of reeds, was a tangible reminder that perseverance, patience, and legal diligence had paved the way for this moment. The neighbors, once spectators and occasional skeptics, began to take note. Some watched from a distance, hesitant yet intrigued by the transformation unfolding before their eyes. Others nodded in acknowledgement as I passed, the tension in their expressions giving way to a mixture of respect and perhaps even envy. The HOA, previously a looming threat, had become irrelevant in the face of concrete facts, lawful authority, and the visible progress of restoration. I felt a profound satisfaction in witnessing the shift, not through confrontation, but through the quiet assertion of rights and careful, persistent effort. Each day, as I continued the work, the lake began to regain its former glory. The shoreline, once littered with debris and obscured by overgrowth, now revealed its natural beauty. Gentle slopes leading to the water, clusters of native plants, and the subtle curves that allowed for both ecological balance and aesthetic harmony. The dock extended gracefully into the water, sturdy and functional, ready to welcome future mornings of fishing, quiet reflection, and family gatherings. With every plank I placed, every stone I arranged, I could feel the realization of a dream that had seemed threatened by bureaucracy and intimidation, now manifesting tangibly, irrevocably, and proudly. I began documenting progress meticulously, photographing each stage of restoration, noting dates and materials, and ensuring that the transformation was recorded not just for myself, but as evidence of rightful ownership and responsible stewardship. The legal victory had granted me rights, but these actions, these tangible improvements, reinforced them in the physical world, leaving no room for doubt. Wildlife continued to return in greater numbers. A family of ducks took up residence along the newly cleared shoreline, exploring the shallow water and feeding in the restored reeds. Herons landed gracefully near the far end of the lake, their reflection mirrored perfectly in the calm water. Even the once elusive turtles emerged, basking on sunlit logs, as if sensing that their habitat was now safe and undisturbed. I marveled at the way nature responded to care and patience. each living creature a symbol of the resilience of life and the restoration of balance. The sense of ownership I felt extended beyond mere legal documents. It was visceral, tied to every decision, every action, every moment of attention devoted to this project. For the first time, the lake felt entirely mine, not in possession alone, but in spirit, in stewardship, and in harmony with the world around it. By the end of the day, the dock was complete, the shoreline largely restored, and the lake glimmered under the setting sun, calm, reflective, and full of promise. I stood at the edge, surveying the scene, and felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. Months of stress, letters, intimidation, and legal maneuvering had led to this moment of clarity and control. The HOA's influence had dissipated, replaced by undeniable facts, careful planning, and persistent effort. I knew that the turning point was not merely the dock or the cleared shoreline, but the realization that ownership, preparation, and knowledge could overcome fear, threats, and false claims. The project was no longer just a dream. It was living, tangible, and unassailable. That night, I returned home, tired but exhilarated, reflecting on the transformation not only of the lake but of myself. The challenges had tested patience, resolve, and intellect, but the victory was complete, a testament to diligence, careful planning, and unwavering commitment to truth. The lake sparkled in my memory as I drifted to sleep, a symbol of triumph, renewal, and the first true taste of freedom from intimidation. The turning point had arrived, and with it came the quiet assurance that the sanctuary I had envisioned was finally, irrevocably mine. Weeks passed, and with each passing day, the tension that had once defined life around Old Mill Lake began to dissipate, like morning mist lifting from the water. The HOA, having received my meticulously prepared legal notice backed by irrefutable documentation from the title search, slowly retreated into silence. The letters that once flooded my mailbox, brimming with threats, demands, and vague claims of authority, ceased entirely. Phone calls stopped ringing with frantic insistence. Emails demanding explanations disappeared from my inbox, and the familiar aura of intimidation that had shadowed my property dissolved, leaving an unexpected but welcome calm. Their withdrawal was not sudden, nor dramatic. It was the quiet acknowledgement that the law was immutable, and that attempts to enforce unrecorded, unenforceable claims were futile. I could almost sense their grudging realization, a slow, painful recognition that the rules they had believed they controlled were not theirs to wield. I walked the shoreline often, observing the change not just in the absence of conflict, but in the way life itself seemed to respond. The lake, once a contested and tense space, now reflected the serenity of rightful ownership. Waterfowl returned with confidence, exploring the gentle shallows, diving for small fish, and nesting along the banks that had been carefully restored. Dragonflies and butterflies flitted over the reeds and wildflowers, their delicate presence a subtle affirmation that the space was healthy, balanced, and secure. The dock, sturdy and immaculately aligned, extended gracefully into the water, ready for mornings of quiet reflection or evenings of family time. It was more than a structure. It was a symbol of persistence, of triumph through knowledge and patience rather than confrontation. Neighbors who had once whispered anxiously at fences, speculating about the conflict over the lake, began to approach me cautiously, curiosity overcoming wariness. Some asked questions about the legal process I had navigated, inquiring about deeds, easements, and property rights. Others expressed admiration for the transformation that had occurred along the shoreline, noting how the lake had been cleared, restored, and revitalized. There was a subtle shift in the neighborhood's perception. Where fear and gossip had once dominated, respect and recognition began to grow. Conversations moved from speculation about who could interfere to genuine interest in responsible property ownership, in the importance of understanding legal rights, and in the beauty of restoring land without disruption. I shared my experience openly, careful to remain factual and instructional, explaining how diligent research, preparation, and adherence to the law had allowed me to protect my property while avoiding unnecessary conflict. I highlighted the importance of documenting every step, of understanding historical deeds, and of knowing one's rights in detail. Many neighbors listened intently, absorbing lessons I had learned the hard way, nodding in appreciation of the methodical approach I had taken. Some even remarked, half in jest and half in sincerity, that I had become a kind of local authority on property rights, a reputation earned not through arrogance but through careful diligence and results. The HOA, meanwhile, remained in the background, their voice no longer a presence to be reckoned with. Their once loud claims of authority over the lake, their threats to halt progress, their constant reminders of supposed community oversight, had evaporated under the weight of indisputable legal facts. I had turned a nightmare of harassment into a victory achieved not with confrontation, but with strategy, intelligence, and patience. Each day I spent at the lake, working on minor improvements, planting native vegetation and observing wildlife return reinforced this triumph. The gentle sounds of nature, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the splash of a fish breaking the water's surface, the soft call of a distant bird, were no longer interrupted by fear or the shadow of intimidation. Instead, they marked a new rhythm, one of calm productivity, peace, and personal satisfaction. I documented these moments as well, photographing the subtle changes in plant growth, the activity of wildlife, and the gradual perfection of the dock and shoreline. Each image became a record of what careful planning and steadfast persistence could achieve when paired with a firm understanding of legal rights. The process was meditative, grounding, and deeply fulfilling. Beyond the tangible restoration of the lake, I felt a personal growth that mirrored the landscape itself. Months of tension, anxiety, and the constant stress of facing an aggressive HOA had tested my patience, resolve, and ability to remain rational under pressure. The experience had forged a new sense of confidence, a deep understanding that knowledge and preparation were far more powerful than confrontation or fear. I recognized that the true victory was not merely in the silencing of the HOA or the completion of the dock. It was in the demonstration that calm, methodical, and legally sound action could overcome intimidation, misinformation, and misapplied authority. Neighbors who had once watched from a distance began to offer help voluntarily, contributing small acts of assistance, advice on native plantings, tools borrowed for minor projects, or simple words of encouragement. The lake, once a point of contention, had become a shared symbol of responsibility, diligence, and respect for private ownership. The environment flourished in parallel with this social shift. Trees that had been trimmed for safety and aesthetic purposes thrived, the water became clearer as debris was removed, and the ecosystem regained balance. Insects and small animals returned in growing numbers, each addition to the habitat a subtle affirmation that care and attention yield results that intimidation never could. Walking along the shoreline in the early mornings, I often paused to reflect on how the landscape mirrored my journey. The lake, restored and vibrant, reflected the patience, knowledge, and perseverance that had guided me through months of tension. The dock, solid and unassailable, was a physical manifestation of strategy and planning. Even the wildlife that returned seemed to acknowledge the peace that had been restored, moving freely without fear, inhabiting a space now safe, secure, and under rightful stewardship. Slowly, the whispers about the HOA faded from conversations in the neighborhood. Where speculation and anxiety had once dominated, there was now a quiet acknowledgement of law, order, and the proper understanding of property rights. The HOA's inability to interfere became apparent not through argument or confrontation, but through the visible proof of progress and the undeniable authority of documented truth. By the time the season shifted toward late summer, the lake was thriving. I could spend hours observing the water, the wildlife, and the subtle interplay of light across the surface, each glance reinforcing the sense of accomplishment. I had transformed a place of potential conflict into a sanctuary of calm and natural beauty. The sense of triumph was quiet but profound. There was no grand celebration, no declaration of victory, only the ongoing, steady affirmation of patience, strategy, and diligence. I realized that the most powerful victories often manifest in subtle ways, through lasting change, restored balance, and the acknowledgement of truth by those who once sought to undermine it. Neighbors occasionally approached me to ask questions or simply to admire the transformation. Some had personal projects stalled by uncertainty about property lines or HOA claims. They sought advice on navigating bureaucratic challenges and understanding the importance of thorough documentation. I shared my experience freely, knowing that knowledge was not only power but also a gift when used to prevent others from enduring unnecessary stress or harassment. And so, the quiet triumph solidified. The lake sparkled under sunlight and moonlight alike. The dock stood firm, the shoreline thrived, and nature had reclaimed its rhythm. The HOA's authority, once a looming shadow, had been rendered irrelevant, and the community had begun to recognize that lawful diligence, patience, and knowledge were far stronger tools than threats or intimidation. I had turned a nightmare into a story of perseverance and ultimate success, a testament to the power of preparation, strategic thinking, and unwavering commitment to truth. Each day I spent at the lake reinforced this understanding, as the tranquil waters reflected not just the sky, but the culmination of months of careful work, legal mastery, and steadfast determination. My sanctuary was complete, not only in physical form but in spirit, and the quiet triumph was mine to savor, subtle, enduring, and undeniable. The evening air was still. The kind of calm that only comes after months of turmoil has finally settled into a quiet rhythm, and I found myself sitting on the dock at Old Mill Lake, letting the soft lapping of water against the wooden posts fill the space around me. The sun was dipping low over the horizon, casting streaks of amber, gold, and deep crimson across the surface of the water, reflections that seemed almost too perfect to be real. I leaned back slightly, arms resting on the edges of the dock, and allowed myself a deep, reflective breath, feeling the weight of months of tension, uncertainty, and conflict finally lift from my shoulders. It had been a journey unlike any I had anticipated when I first purchased the property. I had envisioned a simple restoration project, a place of peace and family enjoyment, but the reality had been far more complex. From the moment the HOA began sending threatening letters, to the day they called 911 in a futile attempt to halt my work, every step had been a test of patience, resolve, and strategic thinking. And yet, sitting here now, I could see that every challenge had contributed to a deeper understanding, not just of property law, ownership, and covenants, but of human nature, persistence, and the quiet power of preparation. I reflected on the legal notice I had sent, the culmination of meticulous research, title searches, and careful documentation. That single act, rooted in knowledge rather than emotion, had turned the tide entirely. It had stripped the HOA of any perceived authority, exposing the baseless nature of their claims and creating space for peace and restoration. I remembered the day I had first seen the police car parked at the edge of my property, the way my heart had raced with a mixture of apprehension and determination. The confrontation could have escalated, could have become a battle of words and threats, but I had chosen a different path, calm, methodical, and rooted in undeniable truth. That choice had defined the outcome. I thought about the nights spent at the county office, poring over decades of property records, deeds, and covenants, each document a puzzle piece that slowly revealed the larger picture of rightful ownership. Hours spent cross-referencing easements, analyzing historical claims, and preparing for possible challenges had felt tedious at the time, yet they had become the foundation of my eventual triumph. Knowledge had become my shield and my sword, allowing me to face intimidation without fear and to respond with clarity rather than anger. The reflection of the sun on the lake glimmered like liquid fire, and I realized how closely the process of restoration mirrored the journey itself. Just as the shoreline had been cleared of debris, overgrowth, and confusion, so too had my path been clarified through careful attention, patience, and strategic action. The dock, now solid and complete, represented more than a functional structure. It symbolized perseverance, the tangible result of a battle fought with intellect rather than aggression. I considered the transformation of the lake itself. Wildlife had returned in abundance, ducks gliding gracefully across the water, frogs calling from the reeds, dragonflies darting in shimmering arcs, and turtles basking lazily on sun-warmed logs. The ecosystem had regained balance, responding naturally to care, attention, and the absence of unnecessary interference. The lake was thriving, reflecting not just the sky above, but the stability, security, and rightful ownership that had been established through deliberate, informed action. My thoughts wandered to the neighbors, many of whom had once whispered with concern about the conflict with the HOA, speculating about disputes and imagined community rights. Over time, their curiosity shifted into genuine interest, some asking for advice on property ownership, legal documentation, and how to protect one's rights without escalating conflict. I shared my experience with them openly, emphasizing preparation, documentation, and patience over confrontation. It was satisfying to see that the lessons I had learned through difficulty could help others navigate their own challenges. I reflected, too, on the nature of authority and power. The HOA had relied on assumptions, intimidation, and perceived dominance, believing that fear could override fact. Yet in the end, threats had no real substance against well-documented truth. Authority rooted in law and clarity is unshakable. Authority built on assumption and intimidation is fragile, easily dismantled by preparation and evidence. Sitting there, the gentle sway of the dock beneath me, I could see how this principle extended beyond property disputes. It was a lesson in life itself. Understanding one's rights, acting with integrity, and approaching challenges with calm intelligence allows for victory even in situations that seem overwhelming. I thought about the process of reclaiming not just the lake, but the sense of peace and control that had been threatened. The work had been painstaking, clearing debris, restoring the shoreline, installing the dock, and observing the return of wildlife. Each action reinforced a growing confidence, a realization that persistence combined with preparation can turn a potential nightmare into a tangible triumph. As the last rays of sunlight dipped behind the distant tree line, the lake glowed with a quiet luminescence. The water was calm, reflective, and undisturbed, an embodiment of the journey I had undertaken. It was a personal sanctuary now, a place where law, diligence, and patience had converged to produce a lasting, peaceful victory. I allowed myself to sit in that moment, absorbing the sights, sounds, and sensations of a lake that was legally, morally, and physically mine. There was a profound satisfaction in knowing that no amount of shouting, letters, or intimidation could have achieved what careful preparation and unwavering commitment to truth had accomplished. The HOA had learned their lesson slowly, painfully perhaps, realizing that their assumptions held no weight against documented law. Their threats, once imposing, had dissolved entirely, leaving a quiet, almost embarrassed retreat. I understood that the lesson extended beyond them. The experience was a reminder that perseverance guided by knowledge is a far stronger tool than aggression or fear. Night approached, and the sky darkened into deep indigo, speckled with emerging stars. The lake mirrored the heavens above, calm and infinite, a perfect reflection of the journey from conflict to resolution. I remained on the dock long after the sun had set, the cool evening air brushing against my skin, listening to the nocturnal chorus of frogs and the distant rustle of small creatures along the banks. Each sound was a subtle affirmation of a world restored to balance, both in nature and in human affairs. Ownership, I realized, was not defined by who shouted the loudest, who wielded the most influence, or who believed they had authority. Ownership was knowledge, preparation, patience, and the quiet confidence to act with integrity in the face of challenge. The lake had become more than water and land. It had become a symbol of all that perseverance could achieve, a testament to the triumph of law, diligence, and thoughtful action over fear, threats, and baseless authority. I rose from the dock as the night fully settled in. The stars reflected across the surface of the lake like tiny sparks of victory, each one a reminder of the careful, methodical steps that had led to this moment. Walking back along the shoreline, I felt a deep sense of fulfillment and peace. The property was mine, the lake was mine, and the sanctuary I had envisioned for so long was finally complete, not merely in structure or legality, but in spirit and essence. And as I turned to take one last look at the shimmering water, I smiled quietly to myself, knowing that the journey had been difficult, the challenges real and the lessons profound, but the victory was enduring, undeniable, and perfectly mine. The HOA had faded into irrelevance, their authority nullified by truth and preparation, and the lake stood as a silent witness to the power of patience, knowledge, and unwavering resolve. In that moment, sitting by the water, I understood fully that this quiet triumph was not the end of a struggle. It was the culmination of a journey, a reflection of integrity, and a testament to the fact that when one stands firm in truth, even the most persistent obstacles eventually yield, leaving only peace, beauty, and the satisfaction of a dream realized.